Allie's ready.
Allie's ready? Okay.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Emerging Professionals Let's Talk About Specs event, or Let's Talk About Specs, baby, event with Cherise Likeside. Some housekeeping things before I go too far. If you have comments, we're going to ask that you put them down in the comments bar. This is going to be muted for everybody other than Cherise. And there will be certain points throughout that we will stop and she will take some questions. So if you have questions, put them in the bar, in the comments. I'm going to do my best to capture them as we're going along. 1 second here. I want to make sure I'm hitting all these bullet points. We want to welcome and thank you for coming to this event. And we also want you guys to be aware that over the next 3 months, we are going to have 3 other epic events going on. We have Joan Liu with Leveraging LinkedIn for Job Seeking in July. We have Tiffany Kopak, Making Tough Decisions and Navigating Career Moves in August. We have Julie Molnar with Doing What You Love, Contributing to the Community and Being Proactive in September. So we hope that you guys can join us for those events as well, as we are evolving to that. And Cherise, do you have anything you'd like to add on those 3 speakers?
No, not right now.
Okay.
They're awesome.
Right. This session is approved for AIA credit. So if you would like to get an attendance report, we ask, reported to AIA, or if you need a certificate to show attendance for other licensing requirements, please enter your name, email, AIA number, if applicable, and whether you would like a certificate emailed to you in the chat box. These requests must be made during the presentation in the chat box. This session is being recorded. It will be available on Portland CSI's YouTube channel. In case you don't know, we do have a YouTube channel, and we hope that you guys go and check it out. It's epic. I think I hit everything there. I also want to introduce you guys to Maddie. Can you say hi really quick, Maddie?
Hey there, thanks for joining us.
Maddie is also part of the Emerging Professionals Committee. And we also have Miranda. Can you chime in really quick, Miranda?
Hi, everyone. Happy to have y'all here.
So these epic events were put on by these individuals. Allie, do you have anything you would like to add before we jump into this?
Just want to let everybody know that, even though everyone's kind of stuck at home right now, we're still doing a lot of different events virtually similar to this. So make sure to check out your website. We should have some more information on some other events as well coming up soon. So keep an eye out on social media and our website. And thank you guys all for joining us. Glad that we're able to spread our reach across the country. I know our last event, we even had some people from outside of the country. So thank you all for being here.
So without further ado, let's talk about specs, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Let's talk about specs. So
Hi, everyone. You're awesome. Hi, everybody. So we're going to talk about specs today, and we're going to get right into it. Approved for AIA credit. Juan already said that. Put all your information in the chat box. Juan said that too, so I'm going to skip right past it. I'm not going to describe the course or the learning objectives because I'm going to let you be surprised. My name is Cherise Likeside. I am the senior spec writer at RDH Building Science currently. I have 30 plus years in the industry, which means I basically started when I was born. I have been in CSI for a little over 8 years, actually 9 years in October. I recently became a fellow. I've done a bunch of stuff. I'm not going to read all this stuff. I've done a bunch of stuff. I'm heavily involved in the Portland chapter. As you see, we have some pretty awesome, amazing people in this chapter. My personal opinion is we are the coolest chapter in the country. For my other CSI friends that might be on this call from other chapters, I'm really sorry you don't get to experience this. I teach the CDT, which we'll talk about later. I speak all over the country, and I do a bunch of other stuff. I would love it if you would connect with me on LinkedIn. If you are on Twitter, my handle is my name, Cherise Likeside. And yeah, that's me. Sessions being recorded. Juan said that. So getting down to business. I am sure that there has to be some of you out there that are asking yourself, why do I need this? I'm not a spec writer. Why do I need to know these things? That's a spec writer's job, right? Wrong. So wrong. And I wish that when I was told this when I was like in my early 20s, I would have listened. But I didn't listen until I was in my 40s. So I am trying to, for those young professionals especially, but anybody in the industry, I don't care what age you are, trying to share just how valuable having this education is. Every single thing you do on a project is governed by your contract documents. So a lot of the things we're talking about today are project delivery and contract documents. There is nobody in any discipline, whether you're a product rep, an engineer, in construction, in architecture, a consultant that doesn't need this education. If you don't understand your documents and don't understand how they work and why things are said the way that they're said in the documents, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to waste valuable time during construction, which is the worst time to deal with a mistake. And you are probably creating risk, unknowingly creating risk when you're working on either your drawings or any of the documents on your project. You need to understand that a whole lot of architectural firms these days don't have trained spec writers. Now, they might have somebody that has a spec writer title, but a lot of times that person is somebody who they were an architect and they did CA and they got a little bit further in their career, because historically people have entered into spec writing a little later in their career. Another thing I'd like to change. And somebody said, hey, you're going to write specs now for the office. And while you do learn things as you go along, sometimes you learn things the incorrect way because your superior, who is your mentor, who's teaching you, is also not trained and doesn't have this knowledge. I call that the cycle of abuse in our industry. I learned this, so it must be right because this person who's older and more experienced than me taught it to me. That's not always the case. I tell people older and more experienced than me all the time that they're doing things the wrong way. Almost no consultants or engineers have any kind of project delivery training or contract document training, which means the more you know, the more you can intercept problems at the pass before they become real problems during construction. But you have to know how to recognize those problems. Product reps and subcontractors are even more of a tunnel vision. I think everybody in the industry has a certain amount of tunnel vision, which is one of my biggest things that I say when I'm mentoring younger professionals is to get out of your box. Go learn about how your consultant works or the contractor works or the product rep works. Because the more you understand that, it really changes the game for how you do your job. So what are you going to learn today? You're going to learn that you have a lot to learn. And that what we go over today is seriously, it is just the tip of the iceberg. All I'm going to do is wet your whistle and have you go, oh shoot, I really need to know that stuff. And there are ways that you can learn more, and we'll talk about that later too. And hopefully, if I was queen of the world, oh, well, okay. So let me just be queen and put my crown on. If I was queen of the world, by the end of this presentation, you will realize just how important and valuable it is to get this education, to understand it, and to use it. And I trust me, for you millennials and Gen Zs out there in the workforce, there's a whole bunch of you. You have such heavy competition between you. I'm the golden goose. I'm Gen X and we're tiny and all the boomers are retiring. And I am the golden goose right now because there's not enough of us to step into the boomer shoes. But what that means for a lot of millennials, a whole bunch of you, like millions of you, you get to step up sooner than history has ever allowed you to step up into positions of responsibility and, you know, into things like partnerships and things like that way sooner than you ever would have been allowed to before. But the people that are going to get to step up and work next to me are the ones that recognize and get these pieces of education that you didn't get in school. So just going to throw this out there. This is a Bible on my desk, has been a Bible on my desk my entire career, even before I got involved with CSI. It's currently called the Project Delivery Practice Guide. My suggestion would be wait till July 30th and buy it then because a new edition is coming out. I still reference this thing on a daily basis when I'm dealing with things on a project or in my documents or I have a question to answer. It will be, I think it's like $100. It will be the best $100 you've ever spent. It is my right-hand man. So a few facts that you need to understand. Nobody in our industry, regardless of your discipline, gets any higher education in college or in their trade school or whatever in project delivery, contractor construction administration, or specifications. There is a handful of architects who will say, oh, no, I had a class, I had a practice class. But when you drill a little bit further in with them, even if they had a practice class, it was more about how to market your firm or how to lead your firm than it was about how to deliver a project. So what does that mean? All of us are running around not knowing how to deliver a project. It drives me absolutely insane because it's such an easy thing to get the education for and totally change your game. Your first real education in contract documents or project delivery, honestly, is going to be when you screw up. Because that's how we have all, I've been around a while, that's how we've all had to learn for years. You make some big mistake and your boss comes to you and says, you can't do that. Or there's a huge change order, and when you dig into the documents and realize you made a mistake, you go, oh, I got to pay attention to that next time. I told my son said to me once, Mom, you got to let me make my own mistakes. My oldest son, smart aleck. And I told him, you know what? You're going to make so many mistakes in this world, but there might be just one or two I've already made for you that you could learn from and maybe avoid that one. And that's kind of how I feel about getting project delivery education and why I do this so often, because it's that important. Know that your consultants and engineers typically never even see a full copy of the documents and all of the requirements until the project goes out on the street, which is way too late to fix something that's wrong. We talked about design firms not having trade spec writers. Manufacturers, I've got this stupid thing in my way in the bottom of the screen, there we go. Manufacturers typically, for any of you reps out there, pay attention, please. You'll make my day if you pay attention here. Manufacturers typically write specs that are incorrect, I would say 98% of the time, and that have risk to me as a design professional. I cannot tell you, I wish I had a poll thing that I could ask you how many of you have cut and pasted a manufacturer's spec into your documents. Don't ever do that. And again, and it's not your rep's fault. It's, you know, usually the higher ups in the company, and they're more focused on sales than they are about truly understanding what a design professional can and can't do contractually. So you need to know that before you just go blindly cut and paste something that looks really technical and awesome and assume that it's right. So where are any of us learning about project delivery? We're not. That's why we continue to have the same problems year after year after year that we had 30 years ago. From the beginning of my career, it's the same complaints, which is another thing that drives me nuts. If we know these are problems, why aren't we fixing it? And we're fixing it because nobody's giving anyone this information. One of the biggest reasons for conflicts is inadequate and poorly coordinated documents. The first thing you really need to understand today, some of you will already know this and some of you won't, is your drawings and specifications on a project are the contract. They are a part of the contract. They're actually a contractual document, and that is why it is so important to get it right. Your contract documents, your drawings and specs are instructions to the contractor only. This is another one partially for the manufacturers out there. I'll get manufacturer specs and they'll have all these instructions to different people on the job site. Our contract with the owner, the design professional's contract with the owner, and in the general conditions says the design professional is not responsible for means and methods. That is all in the contractor's ballgame. So the only person we instruct with a set of specifications and drawings are the general contractor. They decide who's going to do what, how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and all of those different things. So having all of these extra words in your specs instructing all of these other people is actually a risk issue. Your contract documents, your specifications are to communicate the quality requirements on your project. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And to communicate the rules of the road for everybody on the project. 1973, I love this slide. It's my favorite slide in the whole deck. 1973, which I had to do the math. Math is hard. 47 years ago, AIA did this survey with this insurance company, big insurance company, looking at all of their claims and everything, and came up with the top 5 risks in architecture practice. Failure to supervise inexperienced employees, which is something I think that's really important for our young professionals that it might be on this call today to understand. Inadequate project coordination and in-house coordination, failure to communicate between the prime professional and consultants, lack of quality control on design changes, and poorly worded contract documents. Guess what? Anybody know what I'm going to say next? 47 years later, these are still the top risks. That means, oh, I've just got this, I'm in my tunnel and I've always done it this way. Anybody ever says that to me, we're gonna have a problem. It's like we got a fight coming. Always done it this way, or it's never gonna change. It can change, but you're going to be the difference that makes it change. Because in all honesty, boomers didn't do it. Gen X is too small to do a whole lot of anything. And so the millennials and Gen Z have an opportunity to say, we're not going to keep making the same mistakes and having the same problems because it's inefficient and it's laden with risk and it's irresponsible, in all honesty. 1918, the Supreme Court decided what we now call the Spearin Doctrine, and it has held up since 1918. I'm not going to do that math. That's too much math. And basically the Spearin Doctrine says that the contractor is entitled to rely on construction documents that are provided to them that are sufficient for their intended purpose. And if they're not sufficient, they're not responsible for the consequences of errors and omissions or inconsistency in the documents. Basically what Spearin Doctrine says is if our documents aren't good, the contractor's off the hook. You need to know that going out, because one of the other favorite things people like to say to me, which is going to be a whole different fight, is I'll deal with that during construction. My God, if there is any worse time to deal with a problem, it's during construction. There's no such thing as a perfect project. You're always going to have things you deal with during construction. But if you knowingly do something early on in design that you know is going to be an issue later, and I don't have time, there's another one. Oh my God, don't ever tell me you don't have time, because that 1 hour you needed to take right now to get it right is going to translate to be 5, 10, 15, 20 hours during construction to get it fixed. So trust me, you have time. I don't care, find the time. Okay, I'll quit being bitchy. I'll try not to lecture. So your contract, our contracts on your, and there's a lot of variables here. I'm going to go into what is, because we don't have the time today, what is most common. So your typical design contract is what's called the tripartite relationship. And basically, the short version of what that means is that the architect has a contract with the owner and the contractor has a contract with the owner. The people who don't have a contract with each other are the contractor and the architect. But both of their contracts have requirements of things they have to do for each other. Those are called third-party obligations. So I think it's kind of a messed up model, but I don't know when or if it'll ever change, because it almost puts the architect and contractor at odds. They've got to do these things for each other, but they're not actually contracted to each other. And architect asks for all these things, and that takes the contractor a lot of time. And so depending on the project and the relationship, sometimes the contractor doesn't want to do some of those things. And if they're dealing with somebody in an architecture firm that doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't have this education, they might start skipping some of those things. Might not be a big deal, might be a huge deal. But understanding how the contract works is a big piece in, number one, not putting ridiculous requirements in your specs if you're working on specs, to put an undue burden on the contractor. Like, why do you need submittals on 500 things you're not even going to look at? You know, it's something to think about. But by understanding that, we're not going to go into contracts today, but understanding that contract model gives you something else to think about when you're working on a project. The other piece of this contract is consultants are contracted to the architect, and then suppliers and subcontractors are contracted to the contractor. They sign contracts saying that they will comply with everything in the contract that the contractor or architect has with the owner, often without ever seeing that contract. So that's a really important thing for any engineers or consultants that might be on this call, or any subcontractors. You should never sign a little 2 or 3 page contract with a general contractor that says you're going to be bound to the prime contract if you don't ask to see it. And I've had consultants say to me, well, the architect's not going to let me see that. The architect has to let you see that if they want you to sign a contract. So understand that contractual relationship. There are a number of different project delivery methods. We're not going to go into any of these today. But the important thing to understand today is that there are a number of different project delivery methods. And with those methods, your contract documents and your contracts change. The most common one, and what most of what we'll talk about today will be geared around, is the design, bid, build. You design, design's done, you bid the project to generals, and then a general gets the job, and then you build it. But there are other methods, and all of those things affect your documents. Your contract documents, drawings and specs, will be and should be different on every single project and customized to the project. There is no such thing as a guide spec that you can just take and pop in and use on any project without modifying it for that specific project. Because that's people ask me that all through my career. Oh, just throw this in there and that should be good enough. It doesn't work that way. The specs are meant to be written for an individual project, not to throw some out of the box stuff in there with 400 things nobody needs because you think it's safer to leave that in. Contract documents. Your drawings and specs are the contract, and they are complementary. I always have to do this line because people tell me, oh, well, specs take precedence over the drawings, or vice versa. That is not true. While your contract may have a precedent statement in it, saying that is only good for dealing with day-to-day issues on the job site. If you actually end up in court, what the courts are going to go by is what's reasonably inferred. Where was it most clear? And both the drawings and specs will be taken into consideration equally. And that's why the general conditions will say that they are complementary. So never rely on a precedent statement in dealing with issues on your project. Because if you do actually end up in arbitration or litigation, that precedent statement will mean nothing. Say it once and say it in the right place. This is the absolute cornerstone of contract documents. Your drawings are supposed to show the quantities of things and the spatial relationships of one thing to another and where the systems are, or maybe, you know, what each layer is in your enclosure. Your specifications will have all of the details about that. So all of the, what they call the qualitative requirements, and your drawings show the quantitative requirements. So the first time I ever wrote this slide deck, I was working in an MEP engineering firm, which is why toilets are my example. It's changed a lot since then, but I still use toilets. Your drawings would have a drawing of a cute little toilet on the drawing and where that is in relationship to the walls of the stall. Those kinds of things. Your specs are going to tell you that that toilet is stainless steel, what size it is, what kind of flush valve it has, whether it's an ADA toilet. Those kinds of things will be should be in your specs. And so your drawings stay really clean. You should not say stainless steel toilet on your drawings and stainless steel toilet in your specs. It belongs in one place. You don't repeat information in both places. Every once in a blue moon, there's a really good reason to do that, but almost never should you if you're really doing it properly. Here's the reason for that. One of the big complaints everybody always says to me is, oh, the contractor never reads the specs. And Jake, tell me, how many times have you heard that? Or Allie, two architects who now work for general contractors. True? Just nod. Yeah. You know why the contractor will often skip reading the specs if they do that? It's because you put just enough information on your drawings that they don't think they need to. Oh, they have stainless steel drawings or stainless steel toilet made by so-and-so, which should never be on the drawings. So they just go order something and then it comes out, it's the wrong toilet. They never looked at the specs because you put stuff on the drawings to make it easy not to look at the specs. If you do it right, no building can be built unless a contractor reads both the drawings, and I'm not trashing the contractors. They get all kinds of ridiculous documents they have to deal with. I feel for them. So why don't we do it right so they don't have to do that? They have to read both documents in order to build that building if you do your documents right. So common areas in your specifications that need to be coordinated or communicated to somebody else that these are items you need to be thinking about every time you work in documents. And I've got a couple slides of these. I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to pick out a couple key things. You need to know, let's say you're not the principal that signed the contract with the owner in a design firm. You still need to know what your owner architect agreement says. What have we been contracted to design? So you don't kill your budget over designing things that are not a part of our contract. You need to know the general and supplementary conditions. We'll talk about those later. You need to know information about the site or existing conditions and coordinate those with your documents. Whether you're going to separate things out in the bid to get separate prices for. Submittal procedures. There's a big one. I want to pick on that one for a second because this goes right into CA, Construction Administration. So I'm obviously on the design side and I'm a spec writer. So I write in Division 1 all of these submittal procedures that have to be followed by the contractor. And then we put out the specs, and in some firms, well, most firms, the spec writer isn't involved with CA at all. Put out the specs, the contractor bids it, they start building it, and somebody else in the firm is going to be the project manager in the firm and work on that project all through construction. I cannot tell you how many design professionals have never read the Division 1 on their project that they're administering. But they sit and complain to me constantly, contractors sending me all this crap I don't need, and I'm getting all these submittals. And my first question is, what are your submittal procedures on your project? Every single time, that's my first question. Well, I don't know. And I said, well, don't you think you should know what they are and have a conversation with the contractor and say, here's the rules of the road, and this is how we're going to do it. and how it needs to be done. Then everybody's on the same page. I recommend people do this at their kickoff meeting for construction. Take your Division 0 or your Division 1 and go through all of those important things that are the rules of the road during construction, because everybody on the planet's at that meeting and everybody understands it. So you, number one, on the design side, you have a little bit of backbone if you're starting to get things that you shouldn't get or that are eating your time because they're not things that you asked for. And the contractor has a chance to, you know, ask, can we change this, or we can do this more efficiently this way. I mean, these conversations need to happen, and they often don't. Same with contract modification procedures and things like change orders and RFIs and change order requests. You need to outline the rules for that in Division 1 clearly. If you're not writing specs and you're just administering a project, you need to know what your Division 1 says and have that conversation right out of the gate so everybody's on the same page and will work better together. You need to coordinate any meetings. There's lots of meetings during construction. You need to coordinate those things before you start so you don't have a bunch of out-of-the-box language in there for the contractor that requires a bunch of meetings you don't really want. Make sure that you're going through your documents and customizing that once again for your project. You need to coordinate, access panels are my favorite one. It's the architect's job to specify access panels in Division 8, the openings division in the specs. MEP engineers need access panels, oftentimes specialized ones, sometimes for equipment, if it's like really hot equipment. And architects almost never coordinate with them which access panels they need so that they can put that in their access panel section. Instead, they either just throw something in there they think they need. Then your engineer goes and throws something in there because the architect never coordinates with them, so they want to make sure it gets covered. Now you have two different access panels in your documents. Contractor's going to buy the cheaper one and might not ask that question. Maybe they haven't seen that they're double in both places. There's a lot of information in documents. And then you end up having this thing on site that you don't need, that's not going to work, that you have to do a change order for and get the right thing. And on the access panels are huge because either both leave them out or both put them in. But knowing who has to do what makes a difference. You have to, sustainability requirements needs to be coordinated with everybody on the project team. Substitutions are another big one during the bid period. You have rules in Division 1 for substitution requests and how they're going to be handled and what you want to see. If you don't coordinate those things, you end up, again, with this time suck of activities of things you didn't want or need. That kills a project budget. And the more you kill a project budget early on, the less time you have to adequately deal with construction, which is always nobody's fault. Just, you know, construction is a living animal. And things happen or things change and you have to change things. You don't have the money in your contract to deal with issues during construction. Most design contracts are front loaded because the bulk of our work happens by the bid date. So we have like this little bit of our contract, 20% spread out over 12 months or 18 months of construction. You don't have time to deal with things you did wrong in your documents at that point. And, you know, contractors not going to be unhappy about a change order because they make extra money on that. And you can't blame them because they're having to deal with extra stuff because our documents aren't right, and they deserve to make that extra money because it's more work for them. Some other things on here, and we'll make a PDF of this available for people who want it somewhere. I don't know. The bosses will decide that. Common problems, duplicating things on your drawings and specs. Again, you don't want to do that because if, let's say, a drafter goes and changes something on the drawings, the likelihood they're going to tell the spec writer or whoever's writing the specs that they changed that is oftentimes 0 to none. And now you have two different things in your documents. Omissions, just completely leaving things that you need out. Contractual requirements, lack of Division 1 knowledge. That one is bolded because it's like a disease in our industry that nobody ever reads the Division 1 on their project and understands the rules of the road. That alone causes conflicts just because you didn't look at your documents. I had a student in a number of years ago in one of my CDT classes. They were about 2 months. She was the project manager. This was at a prior architecture firm. And she said, can I, and we were talking about substitution requests during construction. Perfect example. And she said, okay, we're 2 months into construction. The contractor has sent me like 40 substitution requests. And this is eating all this time and I don't know how to deal with it. My question was what? What does your Division 1 say? I knew because I happen to be one of the spec writers of that firm. And she said, what do you mean? She didn't even know that there was a different set of rules for substitution requests during construction in her documents than there is during the bid period. And basically those rules said the contractor can't submit any substitution requests during construction unless a product in extenuating circumstances, a product's been discontinued, a plant burned down and they can't get it, you know, those kinds of things. So she didn't know that was there. So she had spent God knows how many hours reviewing 40 substitution requests in 2 months from this contractor because she didn't know her own rules of the road. Big deal. Open communication, what the owner's role is. The owner is not allowed to walk out to the site and tell the contractor to, I'll move that wall over there. There is a path, a food chain of communication in the contract documents so that all of the big players, the contractor, the architect, and the owner all stay on the same page all the way through construction. You need to know those things. Timing of decisions, again, I'll deal with that during construction. That costs everybody more time and money if you make your decisions later that you should have made earlier. Consequences from lack of coordination. I'm sure most of you know these, but the red ones are really the big ones. Loss of valuable time during CA, dealing with all of the conflicts and spending all this time you never had budgeted in your contract to deal with them. Excessive RFIs and change orders during construction because of incomplete or unclear or just inadequate documents. Construction budget overruns. Those are the 3 most common, but if it's a big enough deal, it could become an errors and omissions claim. For anybody who doesn't know what errors and omissions is, it's kind of like a doctor has malpractice insurance. Design firms have errors and omissions. It's our insurance to cover us when we screw up. And it could go as far as going to court, going into mediation or going to court, and possibly losing your client if you don't do a good job on your documents and everybody isn't on the same page. My favorite thing to tell people, if you can't afford to take the time to coordinate your documents in design, then you certainly can't afford to deal with it during construction. I can promise you that. There are multiple methods of specs or methods of specifying different types of specs. We're not going to go into the details of each one of these, but you need to know that there are different kinds of specs, and those specs, all of these, the descriptive performance specs, reference standard specs. I could have a project manual for a project and use every single one of these methods. There is no rule for using more than one in a spec. You use what is the method of specifying. You use what is most adequate for the product you're trying or system you're trying to specify. Sometimes performance requirements are far more important than picking a specific product. So you might write a performance spec. You'll see a lot of that in the enclosure. We're not going to go into those details because we don't have time today, but these are things you need to learn. And I'll tell you at the end how you can learn them too. I guess I'm going to fix that. You could tell I was changing my slides 5 minutes before the presentation. So the project manual. The official name is the project manual, not the specs. We call it that. It's made up of a bunch of sections and a bunch of pages. We all know that. Those sections are formatted. If I could get everybody on the planet to follow the same format, that alone would make everybody's life more easier. But there's actually a guide to how to format a section so that you know what information belongs where. It's called section format. And there's another guide called page format that goes right down into the font you should use, the margins you should use, wording for titles. those are all really valuable things to have everything on a design side. I get specs from 100 different, or not 100. Okay, that was a big exaggeration. 10 different consultants. And it looks like 10 different people wrote that spec. I'm watching Jake and Allie laugh, so I'm wondering what kind of jokes they're cracking over there. I see you. And your whole project manual is organized and numbered using what's called master format. Those 6-digit numbers you see in a spec, if you've ever seen a spec, are master format. Those are not numbers we pick out of the air. Well, some firms pick them out of the air. There's a book. It's like a 300-page book of every number you should use for a section. There's a reason for that. It organizes everything within reason you could possibly have on a construction project based on work results. So all the 0, 3, whatever sections are all the concrete sections. And you've got all these numbers that organize different things. Anything to do with windows or doors are going to be in Division 8 in the openings. And there's a reason for that. When subs go to bid a project to a general, they're going to look for their work. And most of them are, not all, but most of them are pretty ensconced into one particular division. So they're counting on going to that division and seeing all of the sections that apply to them. If you just throw random, I've seen sections not only numbered incorrectly, but in a division that is not remotely related to that work. Well, guess what? That sub might miss that in their bid. And because that's our mistake on the design side, that's a change order for the contractor. Because it's our fault. It's not the contractor's fault. We put it in the wrong place where a sub would not expect to see it. And they missed it. They get 3 or 4 weeks to look at. I would say my average normal size spec is anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 pages. And that's not even counting God knows how many sheets of drawings are going out in specs these days. Contractor gets 2 to 4 weeks to look through all of that, deal with all of the subcontractors and put a bid together. That is a ridiculously short period of time to expect anybody to have caught every little thing. Another reason why it's so important to put things in the right place and understand why they're there and why we do things the way we do. Organizes the work by work results. It does not follow the sequence of construction. And it organizes the work into logical divisions so those subs can find things. I'm not going to go into the details of all the different groups and subgroups and divisions, but know that there are, the facility construction group is where most architecture professionals work, and that's all the different architectural divisions. You can kind of get a vibe just for looking at those items, how work is, corralled into different areas for the subs. 20 through 29 is all the services, things like mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. 30 through 39 is all the site work. And you can see this one example I think is important, this irrigation example. It shows you how you see the numbers, the second 2 digits and then the last 2 digits getting bigger. That's because the scope is getting more narrow in those sections. So there's even, I can look at a section number if it's done properly and know how narrow or how broad that scope is. If that section has a 328000 number, that should tell me, if the specs are done correctly, that irrigation section is going to have everything but the kitchen sink about irrigation in that one section. But if I say 328400, planting irrigation, I know it's just the irrigation for the plantings. It gets down to 328423, and it's just about underground sprinklers. Now, so many people don't number their sections properly that you can't rely on that. You still have to you have to read your spec. That is a big message for the day, is there's no getting around reading your spec. But if you know how to get around a spec and what you're looking for, you can do that pretty quickly. I call divisions 40 through 49 the brewery divisions, because that's where all the process equipment is. If you're building a brewery to make me really good beer, your sections are, the big equipment sections are going to be in this division. So your general conditions on a project. Every project is governed by a general conditions. Again, we're not talking about the one-offs, out of the box, not normal things. General conditions are broad industry requirements that have been vetted through the courts that you can take. AIA's is A201, General Conditions of the Contract for Construction, which most of us use. You can take that and attach it to any project, do some modifications to it. They used to call those supplementary conditions, but now you can actually modify, because of technology, the actual general conditions to fit your insurance or legal requirements for your state. But they're fairly broad. You can attach them to any project, do some minor modifications, and that'll work for your project. They're broad requirements, administrative requirements for your project. Your Division 1 and your specifications are administrative requirements that are more detailed and in addition to your general conditions, not repeating anything in your general conditions, that are specific to this project. And I'll give you an example in a minute. And then part 1 of your specification section are any administrative requirements that are in addition to Division 1 that are specific to that product or system. It's just a good little image to show you how they all play together. So, giving you an example, your general, I'm not going to read all of this, God forbid. Your general conditions has a paragraph about warranties. And it's pretty broad that the contractor is going to warrant to the owner all of these things. You see a couple of things in the second to the last line that are underlined. In the old days, that would have been a supplementary condition line, but now it's done right in the spec. That's a change, or right in the general conditions. That's a change that was made by that architect for that project. So broad requirements saying the contractor's going to provide warranties. Division 1 will then have more specific information, but still broad to the whole project. Division 1 applies to the whole project, not one specific system. So that's an important thing to remember. It will say, okay, here's some other requirements in addition to the general conditions that the contractor needs to comply with on warranties and bonds. Part 1 of the spec section may have even more warranty requirements. In this case, I used a TPO roofing section. So Division 1 might say, provide a 2-year warranty on every product in this job. Well, some things require specialized and longer warranties. So you wouldn't repeat that 2-year warranty requirement because Division 1 applies to everything in the project. That keeps you from having to say that over and over again in every section. But in the case of the roofing, you need this 25-year special warranty. That belongs in part 1 of the roofing section so the contractor sees it, because sometimes those extended warranties are stinking expensive. And they need to know where to look for things. So you need to know that you need to look in multiple places to know what these requirements are, any Division 1 requirements, and make sure that they are in the right place. Now you might be sitting there going, but I don't write specs, so I don't have to do this. You're working on a project, and if you have this knowledge and you can spot something that's wrong, I love nothing more than walking up to my boss or a project manager, and not to be mean, but it's such a teaching opportunity, walking up to them and saying, you can't say this here. Because this is why. They're going to miss it, and you're going to have testing on buildings now is so expensive. You put testing requirements in the wrong place. I'm going to stop right there for a second because that's a good spot before I go to the next thing. And before I take a question or two, I want to ask, can somebody tell me where testing requirements belong in a spec? Come on, be brave, somebody. Part 1, part 2, or part 3?
It depends if it's during production or if it's while it's being installed. It depends, no?
Okay, so, okay, that's a good answer. So which parts can testing requirements go in?
All of them?
Very good. You didn't sound very sure of that, but you're right. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but it depends when and where that testing is happening, which part of the spec section it belongs in. So, Juan, do you have any questions that have come up?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we're only going to do 1 or 2.
Okay. Also, Julie
37
answered.
minutes.
Also,
I'm
Julie
sorry.
answered your last question. Looks like she put execution on there.
Okay, yeah. Well, I've already answered that. It can go in all three parts, depending on when
Okay.
and what's happening.
Cool. So question we have here from Caroline. What is the project size, scope, cost, threshold, which requires or which you recommend a formal specification?
That's, who asked that question?
Caroline Charles.
Okay, I don't know you, Caroline, but you just got the gold star for the day. I just want you to know that. I don't know how many times any of you have heard, we don't have to mess with that. It's just a little project. So, quick story. The biggest payout a firm that I worked for ever had to pay, and I'm not going to tell you specifics because I don't want to give away what firm it was or anything like that, ever had to pay out of pocket after insurance covered damages, was $1 million out of pocket for the firm after insurance covered damages. Who wants to guess at what the fee was for that project? Anybody guessing on there? One?
Less than 50,000.
Okay, anybody else?
28,000.
Okay, the fee on that project was $3,500. $3,500. And it was whatever insurance paid plus $1 million out of pocket for my firm. There is no project too small for a full spec. That doesn't mean that you can't make modifications to that spec, because on a really small project, like let's say Division I temporary facilities and controls, you're not going to put in all those requirements in there for a job shack and all of those different things on a project that tiny. Maybe you're putting in one line saying you'll be given an office in this building for this tiny remodel. It's not that you have to do a humongous spec for every size of project, but you have to do a full specification for every single project. If you want to cover your butt, now a lot of people take shortcuts. It's like, I've never had a problem with this. That's another one. Don't ever say that to me. Because the minute you've never had a problem with it, you're paying $1 million out of pocket. That would have killed some firms. Completely put them out of business. There is no project too small for a full specification. Obviously modified, because every spec is modified to fit that project's requirements. Any other ones, Juan?
Yes. Brian Pensco. Do you have a questionnaire for your design architect to help you write your specs for that project?
I do. I'm at a new firm now, so I'm just redeveloping it for my new firm. I don't go way into the weeds because we have a whole process on how we communicate, because I'm writing specs for 9 offices in 2 different countries. There is no way that I can know every single little decision that got made on every project and every time they're changing a product. So we have a process for dealing with that. But every project I start with, they get a checklist. I call it my spec setup checklist that has a bunch of questions at the top about the client, what kind of project it is, what size it is, any other details they can give me, how we're delivering it. Is it a CMGC project, or is it, design build, or normal delivery? Is it a public project or a private project? So I have a list of questions. It's not exhaustive or ridiculous, because nobody wants to fill out things that are exhaustive and ridiculous. And then I have a list of all the sections I have in my master and which ones at that early point, because we start our specs way earlier than most firms do because of our process. And they go down and kind of check off the things they think they need to get started. So we can start informing that spec way early in design, because design firms are real famous for leaving their spec till the 11th hour, because they're still changing things all the time, and they're worried that if I make this change and we delete things, we're not going to remember to put it back. Well, number one, I use SpecLink, which is a database program, so I don't ever delete anything. I just turn it off, and if they need it back, I turn it back on, because it's a database. It's not a word-based program. But we start way early, partially because we can do that, and partially because we communicate in a Bluebeam session. So, but yes, there are, I have a division 1, 0 and 1 checklist also that they can go fill in some questions on a couple pages, and I can go do the whole 150-page division 0 and 1 without them having to read through every little thing and give me that information.
I have
that
I have a
answer?
couple other small ones here.
Okay.
One of them looks like they're both kind of consultation stuff. One of them I sent to your messages. The other one here is, are sheet specs acceptable for small projects?
No. I don't get any more clear than that. I have been fighting sheet specs for a million years. Number one, literally they take more time to put all those specs on the drawings. And every sheet spec I have ever seen in my entire career has not been complete. And because they're putting them on sheets, they leave a lot of really important things out. I know that interiors is one group that uses sheet specs a lot when they're doing projects that are just interior specific for their architecture firm. In my opinion, they're like one of the worst offenses you can probably do, because because of the nature of trying to put written information on drawings, you tend to try to make that written information as short as possible, and you leave out important things that you should have every time. Nowadays, everybody has even less of an excuse for sheet specs because we have things like PDFs, and I hate to even say this out loud, but I remember the days I did a high school when I was brand new in this business. And I had about a 1,500-page spec, which was, in those days was huge, that I had to copy on a copier, 50 copies of each page, and then assemble the sets myself and distribute them to the bidders. With technology now, there is absolutely no good reason to do sheet specs. And they're just a huge risk issue. You're not saving time, and you're certainly not saving risk. And that's just my opinion. It's just the God honest truth.
All right, last question.
Okay, last
It looks
one.
like Sharbal Mahi, hopefully I didn't hack that too bad. How do you pass accessibility plan check without showing some of that info? Contractor will read specs, plan checker will not. So it's more detailed.
Yeah, well, plan checkers, sometimes building departments don't even ask for that. It depends. If you have to show that for your building permit, then you're going to show it, certain parts of it, but you should not have all of your project information. I'll give you another example of something the building department asks for that we don't do in construction documents when they're going out to bid. Had a building department that wanted the geotech report in the specs, bound in the specs. You should never combine any documents in your specs that is not under your firm's risk umbrella that you didn't prepare. So we put the geotech in the specs for the permit set to the building department. And as soon as we turned in that permit set, we took that geotech right back out. And it went out to the bidders as what we call a resource document or additional project information, but it was not bound under the seal of the architects I worked for because they didn't prepare it. They have a professional practice requirement that they take responsibility for the things under their seal. So you can't take responsibility for something like a geotech report because you didn't prepare it, and that's not in your wheelhouse of expertise. So we just took it back out for the bid sets. So you can put that accessibility information in for your permit set and then take it back out. Or depending on how you write it, there are ways you can address their things and not violate the say it once and say it in the right place. They're not wanting to know which manufacturer you're using and a lot of those kind of details. So you can likely put some of that stuff on your drawings. Just make sure you're not saying it again in your specs. Hopefully that was a decent enough answer. If you have an accessibility consultant preparing it, then you would just put their report in your documents and then take it back out before you issue the bid sets and issue it separately. Okay, Juan, I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Just so everybody knows here, I am happy to stick around as long as people have questions afterwards. I just want to make sure we make it to the end. So, bet you didn't know you were getting an anatomy lesson today, but you are, not one that's uncomfortable. So within all of those different divisions that we talked a little bit about in master format, division 8 for openings and 3 for concrete, etc., are the individual sections. And those sections are numbered with 6-digit numbers, sometimes 8, depending on how narrow the scope gets. There might be a point and 2 other numbers at the end of the 6 digits if it's a super, super specialized narrow scope. And every spec section is organized into 3 parts. Part 1, general, part 2, products, part 3, execution. I see all kinds of names for the 3 parts. Those are the names they're supposed to have. So let's talk about where things belong. Part 1 is the general requirements for that section. Remember, we talked about there are general requirements or administrative requirements for the project as a whole in Division 1. So now you're going to add on to those for things that are only specific to that section. You're not going to repeat them. I can't count how many specs that say the same thing. My favorite one is in Part 1, the first sentence says, the general conditions in Division 1 apply to the work of this project. And it's you could have 70 sections and every section has that in the beginning of Part 1. If you have that, take it out. By contract, they're contract documents and are presented as being complementary and as a whole. The contractor is required to look at everything. That's why we don't have to say things over and over again. You don't need to tell them that that applies. It's under the seal and part of the contract documents, it applies. So Part 1 is going to be a short description of the work of that section. It's going to be submittal requirements for that section, which should not repeat the broad submittal requirements in Division 1, just extra things like a good example of samples. Sometimes we have a lot of the time we have a requirement for the contractor to submit a sample, carpet sample, say. Let's say this is carpet section. We want to see a sample of that section with your shop drawings. Well, we don't want samples on everything in the project. That could be just obnoxious. So it wouldn't say I want a carpet sample up in Division 1. It'll just say some sections will require samples and we'll say what we want in that section. Any specific meetings that are specific to that particular section, so if it's a roofing section, we would put the pre-roofing conference in Part 1 of this section. Division 1 would just say that there are going to be coordination meetings during construction and these are the people that have to attend. But this will say, here's a pre-roofing conference, invite these specific people, here's what we're going to talk about. Any quality assurance requirements. So here's where we go back to that testing question that I asked you. Testing can show up in Part 1, Part 2, or Part 3, depending on where, when, and why it's happening. So any testing prior to construction that is required would be listed in Part 1. Any reference standards that are specific, again, to this system or product would be listed in Part 1. ASTMs or building codes. Division 1 is going to say this state building code applies to this whole project. You wouldn't say that again in this section. You would just say this specific ASTM for testing for this product would go in Part 1. Specific warranty requirements to this product would be in, this product or system would be in Part 1. Part 2 is all of the actual specific product material. What type of product is it? What is it made out of? What finish does it have? What accessories have to go with that? You know, you can say you have a toilet, but it's got to have a flush valve. What kind of flush valve? If depending on the type of specifying you're doing, who the manufacturer is, if it's not a performance spec, who the manufacturers are that are allowed to bid it, that make that product. Performance and design criteria would be in Part 2, should be in Part 2. A lot of firms put it in Part 1, but it belongs in Part 2. Any assembly or fabrication tolerances that are required from the manufacturer's plant or in fabrication, they need to know about any source quality control, any testing maybe that needs to happen at the plant before it even gets to the site. inspections that have to happen during manufacturing or when it arrives at the site before it's actually installed. How you deal with non-conforming work. If something gets put in and it doesn't conform, how you're going to deal with that, and any manufacturer services that you're asking for. Those should all be in part 2. I've seen many of these things in part 1 or part 3, and that's not where they belong. Part 3 is all your execution. Some people call it installation in their specs, but the proper title is execution because there's more going on in part 3 than just the installation. And this is where you're going to give, it's really easy to cross that line of dictating means and methods to the contractor. As a design professional, if you dictate means and methods to a contractor and they do it the way you told them to do it and it fails, you're going to take on the risk, not the contractor, because you put that in your contract documents, and it clearly states that design professionals cannot tell the contractor how to do their work. We can tell them what we want and where we want it to be. And I always joke that, they have a pipe they have to install in the ground. We can show them on the drawings where that pipe needs to be. We can show them that it's 20 feet of pipe. We can tell them in the specs that it's a PVC pipe and, what kind of connections it has to have or whatever. We cannot tell them how to put that pipe in. So we can tell them follow manufacturer's installation instructions. And so my big joke always was contractor goes out there in a tutu with a spoon standing on his head, her head, singing the national anthem and digging the trench for that pipe with that spoon, and you're standing there going, what's this idiot doing? You have zero right as a design professional to tell them they can't do it that way if when they are done, it matches what we have put in the contract documents. Let's hope your contract documents are right, because if it matches what's in the contract documents and we did our documents wrong, they're off the hook, which is only fair. But you cannot tell them how to do it. You can just tell them what needs to be done. And that is really the best way to describe that. So that would be in part 3. Any testing during construction would be in part 3, or any field or site quality control activities, inspections, any adjusting or cleaning that they have to do when they're finished installing something. All the closeout activities would be in part 3, things that have to happen like starting up equipment and showing that it works. But closeout submittals would be in part 1 because it's an administrative requirement of paperwork they might have to submit. Any maintenance things, how you're dealing with non-conforming work once it's already built, and any manufacturer services. Those are certainly not an exhaustive list, but all the things you should expect to see in part 3. So if you're working on a project, you don't write specs, you have nothing to do with specs, but you're doing CA and you're looking through the specs, I can typically spot a conflict in anybody's spec within 30 seconds of opening. If you know where things go and how they're supposed to be worded and how it's supposed to be said, you can just look at specs on a project you're doing CA for and already know before you start doing anything whether you're going to have a bunch of issues to deal with. But you have to know what those things are before you can recognize a problem and maybe head it off before it becomes a problem. Language in specs should be clear, concise, correct, and complete. If you ever take your CDT exam, that will be a question on the exam. Correct grammar, simple sentences. Any engineers on the call? My friends, you do not have to write the Bible when you're writing a spec. You do not need 85 paragraphs to say what I can say in one sentence. I love engineers, but man, they write a lot of stuff in specs. You should not use unnecessary words. We do not write sentences in specs the way you write them if you're writing an essay. But you still don't ever shorten a sentence enough to make it where you lose the clarity. They need to be correct in giving the information accurately and precisely and complete, not leaving out important information. I added a 5th C if anybody's getting ready to take the CDT, because I happen to know I've got at least one on this call. Do not even listen to this last thing because I don't want to confuse you on the test. I added coordinated. Say it once and say it in the right place, and you have, just with that one change, a far bigger chance of getting it right and not having conflicts. Use simple sentences. Long, complex sentences are hard to understand and they're stilted. Oftentimes when people are writing a sentence that's the size of a paragraph, they'll put in a lot of extra commas and punctuation. You don't want a sentence. Oftentimes there's different people working on specs, or maybe you have administrative staff helping you type them and they leave a comma out. And this sentence is 48 miles long. Well, guess what? They left that comma out because they're typing all of this crazy amount of stuff, and now the sentence means something else. It reads completely differently. So that's a good way to test yourself. Could I look at what I just wrote for this spec and take out this punctuation and have it mean the exact same thing? You want to use words that are simple and clearly understood. Using this big technical word for something that your average Joe wouldn't understand is not serving you. You have no idea who's going to be reading that spec on the job site and whether they know that big technical word for this thing that you're specifying, or they just call it JIP. You want to make sure whatever you're writing can be clearly understood by pretty much anybody in the industry. I'm not necessarily saying a 3-year-old, but close. You use the imperative mood when you're writing specs. That means the verb defines the action. No kidding. I can say install pipe, and I've given the contractor every instruction they need. Because this is, the verb defines the action. Most of this is going to be in part 3 where all of the execution requirements are. It's going to go up and look in part 2 to see that it's, PVC pipe and whatever the details are about that. Install pipe. I'm not saying we don't say other things, but that's the kind of simplicity that should be in specifications. Concise and readily understandable. The word shall. All I'm going to say is if you're using the word shall in a sentence in specifications, you're using a bunch of other words you don't need as well. I would say 1 out of 1,000 sentences actually requires the word shall. I call it the F-bomb of spec writing. You don't need it. It makes your specs wordy and monotonous and harder to read and actually kind of sound holier than thou. You don't need that. And so if you see specs with a bunch of shalls, that's one of my first clues that I need to look closer at that spec right out of the chute. Abbreviations, those are fine on drawings. You shouldn't see them in specs. They can be effective on drawings, especially if you have a key for them, but they should largely be avoided in specs. I see abbreviations all the time in manufacturer specs, and I have to go rewrite all of it, which drives me insane. When numbers are used to define both size and quantities, you use the actual symbol for the number, but you spell it out if it's a quantity. So it's 2-inches, not 2 in the inch mark. Also, if a set of drawings gets real dirty on the job site, that 2 inches might look like 2 feet. And it's happened, depending on what it is. 2 boards, 50 degrees F. That's how you write a temperature, 20%. You want to be clear, but it needs to be spelled out in the proper way. So there's no, those little tiny symbols like the percent mark, that stuff can be so easily either left out in a typing mistake or in missed. And depending on where it's going could totally change what you intended in a document. We capitalize a bunch of words in specs that you don't see capitalized in normal writing. I don't know how many times I've had an architect or an engineer try to correct my specs and uncapitalize stuff. And it's because in the general conditions, there are specific nouns and proper names that are defined in those conditions of the contract that you wouldn't capitalize in normal writing, but because they're in the conditions of the contract, you do capitalize them in a specification. So if you see that, don't start correcting it all until you check your contract in general conditions and see if it's something that's defined there, and that's why it's capitalized. That's why architect is capitalized everywhere you see it. I've had people say to me, oh, architects have this huge ego. They capitalize architect everywhere they go. There's a reason for it. Things you should not, and these are, if you're not writing specs and just either doing CA or working with them or reading them and trying to understand what's going on, if you see a lot of these terms, then you know you're looking at a spec that probably wasn't written by somebody who has experience or trained. And so you know to look at that document closer. As approved, as indicated, as required. Everybody does it. And you need to stop doing it. As indicated. What did you just tell me? Install pipe as indicated. As indicated where? There's 2,000 pages of specs and 400 sheets of drawings. I actually saw it's about a $20,000 change order paid at a previous firm over the word as indicated. Because you didn't say as indicated where. You can say the words if you're going to say as indicated on detail 25/10.1 in the name of the detail. But if you're going to do that, you better make damn sure that detail doesn't change or move or change numbers. So I say, just don't do it. Say what you need to say. That's a lazy way out. That's a lazy spec writer, as indicated, because I don't want to go figure out where it is. Words, again, we're not writing the Bible, so you don't use words like here and after, here and before, here with. Any or all are inappropriate terms. You don't need to say install all pipe. It is implied if you say install pipe that means all the pipe, etc. That doesn't mean anything. It's ambiguous. As per. I hate those two words. You shouldn't say to the satisfaction of anybody, because again, that's subjective. What I am satisfied with and what somebody else is are completely different things. The word also is inappropriate. Minimize or avoid the use of pronouns or things like which. You can take all the thes and a's and all of this stuff out of sentences and still have a completely clear sentence that's half as long and twice as clear. We talked about the word all being unnecessary. Here's an example, store all millwork under shelter. All you need to say is store millwork under shelter. Streamlining. You can use modifiers to streamline, to take out extra words. I just write my specs in the masters this way. And I'm not saying go in and every time if you're working with somebody else's specs, go rewrite every section every time. But all of these are also indicators that you're looking at something that may not have been written properly or written by a trained person. And you know where to look and when to look for things to keep yourself out of trouble. Using a colon in specs is beautiful for keeping sentences really short. It's one of my favorite tools, so I don't have to write as much, but I can say everything that I need to say. There's a couple examples. I've got 8 minutes. I think I'm getting close to the end. Use the word amount when you're talking about money, quantity when you're writing about numbers or measurements or areas, things like that. Don't use the word any, it's imprecise. The word either implies a choice, while the word both is all inclusive. Understanding that and how somebody may interpret a sentence is important. I love this one. Flammable and inflammable mean the same thing. But the biggest one and the reason it's red on here is furnish, install, and provide. The word you want to use, if you want the contractor to both get that product and install it, is provide. It is a generally accepted principle that provide means furnish and install. But if you say furnish an HVAC unit and you don't say install it, guess what? You're going to have an HVAC unit sitting there and there's no requirement or a bid for the contractor to install it. And typically a contractor might ask that question, but you work with all kinds of contractors at different levels of experience depending on the size of the job. And we use furnish when we want oftentimes you'll see owner furnished, contractor installed type of items, or contractor furnished, owner installed kind of items, where we only want the contractor to get the material, but we don't want them to put it in, and then we say to furnish it. Or the owner buys something and we just want the contractor to install what the owner's buying. You'll see that a lot on big equipment. Then we're just going to tell the contractor to install it. So knowing how important the difference is in those three words and what you're communicating in your documents is critical. I've seen change orders paid on this issue as well. Shall means something is required. You're only going to use that once in a while. Will means it's optional. You don't want to use words like must and is to. You just sound bossy and overblown, and it's unnecessary. Remember that your contract documents are instructions to the general only. So you don't put language in your specs like the subcontractor's going to do this, or installer's going to do this, or manufacturers are going to do this. You just tell the contractor this has to happen. It's up to them to decide who's going to do it. Don't want to cross that means and method lines. We're almost done. Yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it in the hour and a half. Don't dictate safety requirements in your spec. All safety on the site is the contractor's responsibility. You're taking on risk in your firm if there are safety requirements in your firm. You can tell the contractor to comply with OSHA requirements or whatever, but you cannot tell them what safety requirements they have to have. So knowing that, or spotting it in your documents. Maybe you're a young professional, you're just looking for the spec to make sure that your drawing language matches the specs, and you see that, you get to go tell your boss something they don't know. And boy, don't you look like the one I want to promote next. We talked about this a bit before, don't put documents in your specs that your firm didn't prepare unless the firm that prepared them is directly contracted under your contract for that project. So like I can put structurals information in my specs and MEPs because they have a contract with my firm for that project. But things like geotech reports should never go in a spec, hazardous materials reports, anything like that prepared by somebody outside, typically hired by the owner. They should be issued with the documents as an additional resource document, clearly stated. There's a section in Division 1 called Additional Project Information, where you list those things and say, these are not a part of the contract documents, but they are things the contractor needs to be aware of. Your Division 0 procurement documents in Division 1 have to be coordinated with the agreements and general conditions on every project. You should be coordinating your drawing language with your specs for consistency. You should not be changing your specs to match your drawings. Oftentimes, I'll see on the drawings, going back to something simple, they'll use some shortened abbreviation on the drawings, and next to a wall section or something, it'll just say JIP. Well, my specs have 8 different kinds of JIP board. So you tell me which JIP goes there. How it should be done is I should list the 8 kinds of JIP board and number them in my specs, and the person on the drawings should have JIP 1, JIP 2, or even a title, just the title next to it, not the information about the project. JIP 1 moisture resistant, or something like that. So that but it needs to match the drawings or the spec information, not the other way around. I make my specs available to every project team, to all the designers. I invite them all into the Bluebeam session so they can just have it open and click in there and say, hey, am I calling this the same thing as it's listed in the specs, so that there's not confusion for the contractor on what you want there. Also know what your owner is contracting with the contractor for. Oftentimes contractor will have things they've excluded from their contract that they're not going to be responsible for. You need to know as a design professional whether you need to deal with those things or not, so you don't do extra work. There's a beautiful book out there. I love this book. I'd love to scare everybody with it. It's called The Contractor's Guide to Change Orders. There are other versions of this book, but basically it's about 287 pages, I think. I use it in a lot of my presentations. It is a roadmap to find, if you're a design professional, it's a roadmap for a contractor to find your mistakes. Everything that we've just talked about and a whole lot more is addressed in this book. If you see it, the book will say, if you see these words, go do this, this, and this, you're probably going to find a change order. Knowing that there are actual guidebooks on how to find where you screwed up should be motivational. Most contractors I work with are amazing. And everybody comes to the table and there's compromise, you work well together. But we all know that there are contractors who are not. And knowing, and we don't want change orders in to deal with that stuff during construction anyway, but knowing that they have a roadmap to find where you screwed up should be motivation enough to learn what you need to know about contract documents. We talked about this earlier. Your ability to control costs is much stronger at the beginning of the project, and the later it gets and the more work you've done on your documents, the harder it is to control the costs on the project. And the cost of those design changes adversely. Cost of design changes early in design, you realize there's a mistake, you coordinate this and you fix it early in design, costs a little bit of money. The later you get, once you hit the bid date, that skyrockets and almost goes straight up, because there's a whole lot more involved when you have to deal with changing a mistake during construction. Few tips. I think this is the second to the last slide. Educate yourself and your staff. There is absolutely no excuse for not understanding your contract documents to which you are legally bound. They are a contract, they are a legal document. There's cost-effective ways to get this training. The best way and the only comprehensive way that I'm aware of, there's all different kinds of people that teach little pieces and parts, is to get your CDT, Construction Document Technologist certification from CSI. Or if you don't want to get the certification and have the letters after your name and be all important, take the class and just learn the materials. I happen to teach the class in Portland, and this is not a sell CSI thing. I do all of this. I don't get paid for any of it. I do it all because I'm that passionate about how important it is and how much it's a game changer. I've taught hundreds of people now in the last 7 years, and I have yet to have one student after the 10-week class that hasn't said to me, that's one of those most valuable things I've ever done. If you're a young professional on the architecture side who's in the process of your AREs at all, this will also help with your AREs. There's 2 testing periods a year, spring and fall. I teach both of them. We are doing our class exclusively online now. So it doesn't matter where in the country you are, you can take it. Mine starts on August 12th. And I want to say, I forgot now, I think it's Wednesday nights for 2 hours. I think it was 5 to 7. All of the information will come out on Portland CSI's website. There are other chapters around the country that also teach it. Mine is 10 weeks, 2 hours a week. It'll come out on our website on July 1st, so you can go look at it there. I won't go into details, but it is cradle to grave project delivery and contract document training. So all of these things that we've barely touched on today, plus a whole lot of other things, what you should be doing in schematic design, and it doesn't matter what discipline you are, whether you're a product rep or an engineer or an architect, we talk about all of that through all of the processes for CA, how to appropriately change your documents. There should never be a change on a submittal. You have to take the class for me to go into that. But so just know that that's available out there. And if I was queen of the world, nobody would be allowed to work in this industry. I'm wearing a crown, but I'm not technically queen of the world. Nobody would be allowed to work in our industry without that. It was a game changer for me. And my boss, who told me 30 years ago I should do this, and I ignored him, and I did it 7 years ago or 8 years ago. And I not even tell you how much I regret that I didn't listen back when I was 22 and do it then, because it changed my game that much. I can't even tell you just in the last 7 years what my career has done. And while that CDT is not solely responsible for that, I already had a ton of experience, but now I knew how to do it right. And I had this level of knowledge that nobody else around me had. And it is a game changer. Don't be afraid to be proactive and push communication on your teams and with your PM. Ask a lot of questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question. So many younger professionals tell me, I don't want to sound stupid and it's my boss. And there is no stupid question. But if your boss really makes you feel that way, number one, you might want to think about whether you want to work for that boss. Then email me and ask me. But don't make a mistake or let fear stand in your way and make a mistake because of it. Don't, if you are a firm owner or a senior person in your firm, don't let untrained people touch your specs. They don't have to become a full-fledged spec writer, but at least have them learn the basics so they're dangerous enough to ask the right questions and ward off problems and help your team ward off problems if they don't have that education. And find a mentor. If you're a younger professional, find a mentor who is actually trained in contract documents and provide in project delivery and doesn't mind answering a question. CSI is a great place to do that. They've become my family. I'm not kidding. I have people all over the country that I could call unannounced and say, oh my God, I need your help, and they'll drop everything and help me. Don't let anyone, just let anyone write specs, educate your staff and your support staff. You'd be amazed at how much your support staff can help you. You know, you're giving them all this stuff to type, and if they know what it's supposed to look like, they can correct it. I do it with manufacturer specs all the time. I get a manufacturer spec, and the first thing I have to do is rewrite it because they're never the way I need them to be in a design contract. Get them all, get your support staff CDT certified. They can help in so many ways you don't even realize. My motto is total world domination, just so you know that. So I'll keep doing this until somebody listens to me. Thank you for coming and putting up with me. And I am now available to answer questions as long as anybody wants to ask them. And I don't know if you want to give me what you have on the chat, and then anybody can just chime in if they want, or.
Okay, I got a couple.
Okay.
First off, what do you do if your consultant places vertical transportation consultant, example, their specs on their drawing sheets? Reject it?
That's a loaded question. Vertical transportation, I love that. Elevator consultant. That's a loaded question, especially the really small, narrow scope consultants. Sometimes that's all they have. And they would probably give you an even bigger mess if they tried to write a spec section. So I'm not saying that you can't allow that sometimes. I would suggest that you read through if that's all they have and the only way they do it, because that's common for some civil firms as well. I don't like it, and I would prefer specs, and I really push for that. I would read through what they have and make sure they don't have conflicts in there, because if they're doing it all like that, they're probably leaving a lot of things out. Consultants are also famous for repeating a bunch of stuff that's in Division 1, because Division 1 applies to all your consultant specs as well. Rather than call you and say, is it okay if I put this submittal requirement in there, or this cutting and patching requirement, or whatever. So regardless of whether your consultant is putting their specs on the drawings, and landscape also does it, or giving you actual sections, you should be looking them over and making sure there's no big glaring problems. It can be done. It's not preferred. But if you're going to tell your consultant who doesn't have specs that you want them, tell them way early in the game. Don't hit them with that the day before a deadline, because that's really unfair to consultants to get something that might take them a little bit of time. Or make it a requirement in your agreement with your consultants right out of the chute. These are the deliverables we will expect for you. Full 3-part specification sections written to CSI format. I tell a lot of architects that your consultants would get a whole lot better about their specs if you started putting in your RFPs to consultants before you're even hiring anybody. We'll put out an RFP to consultants for a big job, and we'll ask for all this resume information. Add a line that says how many of your staff are CDT certified, because it'll be 0. I can guarantee you that, but I can also tell you this. Any principal worth their salt in any firm sees that all their architects are starting to ask for CDT certification of their staff during documents. They're going to be going, I better figure out what the hell that is and get some people here that actually have that. they learn that, they start writing better specs and doing a better job on their drawings and not repeating information or creating conflicts with the architect. Probably more
Okay.
information.
So CSI states that schedules can be inserted into Part 3. I have not found an example of this. Is that from the older version of master format?
It happens. I've done it. I've done it recently. I prefer that schedules go on the drawings. Personally, that's my personal preference. Just because it's usually somebody on the design team that's putting the schedule together anyway, because they're scheduling everything on the drawings. And then they give it to me, I put it in the specs, and they change it, and they have to give me another one, and it's just for efficiency purposes. I think it works better on the drawings because they can just go into their drawing and change it. But I have regularly over the years, I see it less and less and less these days. But yes, they can be put, it's usually, if there's a schedule, it's usually the very last article in Part 3. And it's titled schedule, and you put your information in there. You can do that, and it's completely appropriate. Just make sure that schedule is not repeating things already on the drawings. It shouldn't be. I've seen some firms go put them in both places, the same schedule. That should not happen. It's one or the other.
Here's one is from Austin. Is the phrase or approved equal when specifying a product still inappropriate?
I love that convert. That's like, that can be a whole like 2-hour session all by itself. There is no such thing as an equal. Even if they are two products that look damn near identical, there are no two things that are made exactly equal. I don't even use that I just say substitutions, colon, per the requirements of section, whatever it is, substitution requirements. And in our substitution requirements, general administrative requirements in Division 1, we list out what we consider an equivalent. We use the word equivalent, not equal, because there is no equals. And so we'll list out and define in our Division 1 section that an equivalent project will be something with, a like physical and chemical makeup that performs the same way, because there is no perfect equal. If you were trying to put 3 equal products in every, public work requires three manufacturers. Well, there are no 3 equal manufacturers. So if you're going to use that statement, say, or approved equivalent, and then define in Division 1 what equivalent means.
Okay. Do you offer or can you recommend a spec writing course?
I believe we just talked about the CDT. That is the first level of spec writing. It also, it teaches a whole lot more than just specs, but everything, your contract plays into your specs, and CA plays into your specs. All of those things play in, but the CSI CDT education series is the best place for you. If you're looking to become a spec writer, and by the way, we have a huge amount of older spec writers retiring right now, so there's a real need in this niche. If you have a fondness for it, you can do very well for yourself. But there's a substantial amount of training to become a spec writer. After you get your CDT, your next level of training would be the CCS, which is a Certified Construction Specifier. But trust me, there's no way on God's green earth you're going to pass the CCS test without doing the CDT first, because most of it's not going to make sense. You need all that base knowledge of what happens at every phase and what's supposed to be in the documents and where it belongs. We barely touch the surface in this class, but the CDT is where you want to go if that's what you want to do.
And Allie, please correct me if I'm wrong. By the way, this comment was brought to us by Rachel Stotler. We do have scholarship opportunities for emerging professionals.
Yes.
Correct, Allie?
Yes, for emerging professionals in the Portland area, we have a scholarship for the CDT that if you're interested, we're going to have information posted on our website July 1st. But anybody with 10 or less years experience in the industry is open to apply, and we'd love for anybody to apply for that.
Thank you, Allie.
And I'm your teacher for those 10 weeks, so you could be totally stuck with this crazy lady that wears a crown. I mean, I would love to have you in class if you're interested in getting your CDT, but I don't care how you get it or where you get it. The knowledge, I mean, it's great to get certified. Personally, I would not want to do all that work to learn all of that and not be able to put the letters after my name too, to brag to everybody that, hey, look at all this work I did. But even if you just get the project delivery practice guide and read it, because that is the textbook for the CDT as well, it will be a game changer for you in understanding things that you had no idea you needed to understand.
Okay, continuing on, there's quite a bit here, Cherise.
Oh, great.
You mentioned that you use SpecLink. We are currently looking into switching. Can you share the pros and cons?
For me, there's one big one. I'm not going to go way into software. I haven't used, I've used MasterSpec. It's been a lot of years, and I don't think it would be fair to speak to it now because I've used SpecLink for the last 10. But what I can tell you is SpecLink is a database-driven program. So all of your spec, it comes out looking like a spec section, but it's not a word-based program. So all of your information is in basically, the best way I can describe it is if you're in an Excel spreadsheet and all your numbers are in cells, that's kind of how it is in SpecLink. And so you don't have to, in a word-based spec writing program, you have to delete content to get your spec where you need it to be for the project. In SpecLink, I just click a little square box over to the left and turn off the paragraphs I don't need. Still have to do some actual editing within stuff. But there are a lot of features that it has, like I can set the headers and footers for 400 sections in about 12 seconds in one window. And I can change, if you're a consultant, I don't know if you're in architecture or consulting, but if you're a consultant, consultants have to change their specs for every project they do for an architect, because every architect has some different format they want followed. You can actually change your format in one window, and you can even save the formats. I used to, when I worked in MEP, I had a bunch of formats changed for different architects, or saved for different architects, so I could just click that and it would apply to the whole project. So there are some really huge efficiency things that make SpecLink my program of choice. I honestly, I won't work in Word specs. When I got this job, the first thing I asked is, how do you do your specs? And they had Word specs, and they said, well, I need you to let me get SpecLink. And they said, well, that's why we're hiring a spec writer. So, you know, and I love, that's one of the reasons I went to work there, because they really respected my opinion, but, and it's a great company. The efficiencies are so huge for me in SpecLink that that's my program of choice.
Will the August 12th class utilize the second or third edition study guide?
It will utilize the third edition and brand new slides that I will have about 2 weeks to learn. It will use the third edition. The second edition, if you happen to already have it, will suffice. But if you don't already have the book, wait till July 30th and get the third edition. You might as well have the most up-to-date one. And I will walk you through, I mean, I can't tell you what's on the test because I don't know, the FBI has it in Fort Knox somewhere. I don't know what's on the test any more than anybody else. But there's a roadmap for what you need to study. It's only been 7 years since I took mine, for one thing. I know where they're from, and I chaired the committee that wrote all the educational materials for a number of years. So I'm pretty well versed in this, and I point out all throughout the class what kinds of things that they're going to be looking for. This is the first level of certification. It takes you cradle to grave. So there's a lot of content, but I will guide you into where you need to focus extra study and at what level that this exam will take you.
CSI's PRM mentions that with multi-prime contracts, that specs could or should, I cannot remember which, be written for each individual prime. Why would someone do that?
So number one, please put the PRM in a museum and get, it's been, well, let's put it this way. I've been in CSI for almost 9 years now, and the PRM was out of date at that time. Why would somebody have more than one spec on a multi-prime contract? Because, well, number one, you have more than one building and more than one contractor. And there might be subtle differences between one and the other. If they're not exactly cookie cutter, it would be more clear and easier for everybody involved if there is a separate spec for each contract. Do you disagree over there? I see Jake making a face. I think it's more clear. I know it's more stuff for you to read, but it's really, really difficult for a spec writer. Say you've got two buildings that are a lot alike, but there are just a handful of differences. If they're not really cut and dried, it gets really difficult to clearly define those in the documents and not be confusing. It can be done, but it takes so much extra time that it's really more efficient to write two specs, in my opinion. And then hoping everybody communicates to you each one of those little differences. That you start to get in a section, in this building do this, and this building do this, and this building do that, and they go change something. It's clearer for the team who is less understanding of specifications to just look at this project, this building, and know what they're comparing to the drawings. So yeah, you can do it either way. I prefer separate specs.
Do you need a separate E&O insurance for spec writing as compared to design E&O?
Depends. If you, I gotta take this thing, it's starting to hurt my head. It depends on how you're working. If you're working within a firm, like I am, the Arizona emissions insurance covers me under that policy. If you are an independent spec writer where you're writing specs for a bunch of different firms, you're going to do it one of two ways. You're going to get your own Arizona emissions insurance, or I know a lot of independent spec writers that when they contract with an architect, they have a clause in their contract with the architect saying that the architect will go get a additional insured thing on their Arizona emissions policy to cover that spec writer for that project, that independent firm. But independents will do it one way or the other. They'll either get their own or they will require the architects that they work for to cover them. But if you are an actual employee of a firm, you're covered under their E&O.
What do you look for in manufacturer substitution requests?
Substitution requests, well, that's another whole 2-hour session. Personally, at least at my current firm and at most of the firms I've been at, I don't review your substitution requests. The design team does during the bid period, although they will bring them to me and ask me questions about things. I will tell you that a lot of substitution requests will never even get reviewed. We put requirements in Division 1 for what we want them to look like. And there's a reason that mine say that we want it on the CSI form. And we want you to give us a document that shows us a side-by-side comparison of the major components of your product and the one we have specified. Because we put a lot of work into picking the products we want for this project up front. And so if you're going to ask us to allow you as a substitution, the easier you make it for us to compare your product to what we already have, the more likely we're going to actually review that substitution request. Now, I will qualify that I have heard of people who just don't even review any of them and just deny all of them. And I've heard of people that suck so much ridiculous amounts of time reviewing them, it's not even funny. So my best advice is follow the requirements of Division 1 of what they want to see. Don't send a bunch of extra stuff, and make it real clear on one page the major components in comparison with what we've already chosen.
Are there any resources that you would recommend to practice writing in imperative mood? Mary finds it difficult as English is their second language.
Oh boy, I don't personally know of any resources except for maybe, I mean, not specifically anything just to write in an imperative mood. You know, obviously like maybe a community college, you know, beginning writing class or something like that might be something that could just help with that. I ask myself all the time, and obviously English isn't a second language for me, but I ask myself all the time, is the verb defining the action? It's the, what action are you doing and what action do you want done? When I'm trying to make a sentence more concise, what you know, what extra words can I take out? I think the best thing I can tell you to do is find a really good spec writer and ask them to give you a copy of one of their specs, and just read through some. Don't read through any spec because there's a lot of really bad specs out there. But get your hands on a spec written by a well-respected spec writer and just read through it, and you'll get the vibe pretty quickly. That's probably the easiest and most effective way to just get that down. Sometimes you need to say more, sometimes you need to say very little, but that's the best way to get that vibe.
Caroline Charles says, thank you, Cherise. Wow. I will see you on August 12th. And why are you not paid for the CDT training?
Okay, no, I want to answer that. So Jake and Allie, that you guys can see here with the Portland CSI tag. Allie is our current CSI president for one more week. You're not going anywhere. Jake is on our board and also happens to be her husband. I think they were our first CSI wedding that I was lucky enough to go to, which was really awesome. I'm not paid because I would not even consider being paid. I have been paid a couple times where a company has contacted me and asked me, would you come teach the CDT series to our staff, specifically just to our staff, on our time in our offices. And so I have been paid a couple times. I do it for CSI because I'm passionate about how important it is, because this is a value added thing for our members, and CSI is like my second family. I do this because I believe in it and because I want to help you not make the same mistake I made in ignoring my boss 30 years ago and not doing this, because it's that much of a game changer. It's really a passion project for me. Even if Jake and Allie, we joke that they're my parents because they're the ones that make me behave. I wouldn't even consider it. That's not why I do it. But that's, I think, because sometimes I think because I preach CSI everywhere I go, that it's really important that people know from me that I am not preaching CSI to sell anything. I would be the world's worst salesman because I am way too stinking honest, and I am going to tell you what is not worth your time, and at least in my opinion, and what'll be a game changer for you. But I believe in this. I really believe in this, and it makes people's lives easier, and we all have to work in this industry. At some point, I will have, or maybe already have, worked with some of you. If we're all speaking the same language, work is not half as frustrating for me, or for you, or for Jake and Allie on the construction side. That's why I'm not paid, because this is my thing. This is my thing. Any other questions?
The September event is all about that, Cherise.
I know it is, but I'm not teaching that one.
Right. So check that out later, guys.
That's Julia, and she's like super badass. So
How can one identify a really good spec writer before reading a really bad spec?
you guys just have all kinds of loaded questions for me. I'll be perfectly honest. The only place people get this training holistically is in CSI. So the first thing I would look for is, do they have their CDT? Do they have their CCS? I will tell any of the product reps on this call, the first thing I ask you when you come to my office is if you have your CDT. And the reason I ask you that is because if you tell me you do, we can get right into the nitty gritty, down and dirty right away on what we need to get done, because I know you speak my language. If you don't have it, I know I have to sit there and ask all these other questions because you don't understand what I can and can't do in my design contract and what I can or can't do on a public project versus a private project. So I would start there. I'm not saying that every CSI certified person is a great spec writer, but I will tell you most of them are going to be about 1,000% better than somebody who's just writing specs for a firm. Even if they're not the best spec writer on the planet, they're still going to be 1,000 times better than somebody who just picks it up and thinks they know what they're doing.
With performance specs, would the contractor be held to provide warranties and guarantees at closeout or prior?
Well, that should all be defined in the spec on what warranties have to be provided and what performance requirements have to be met. And hopefully, if the design team and spec writer are doing their job, they're going to assure that whatever performance requirements they're specifying, that those performance requirements can be warranted. Warranties are a pain in the rear end. I'll be the first one to say that. There is no specifier that has the time to go read the gazillions of pages of tiny fine print and legal language of every warranty on every project. You get familiar with the standards and you get into performance specs and it gets a little bit dicier. So you're hoping that your design team has done their homework. So the only thing then that the contractor is going to be held to is that they've built it to those performance requirements. Then it should be able to be warranted because the design team checked that ahead of time. That's how it should work.
So I'm going to ask Ariel's question one more time. Apparently they had to step away really quick, but now they're back. What do you do if your consultant places, example, vertical transportation consultant, their specs on their drawing sheet? Reject it?
Didn't we answer that? Oh, did they leave when I answered that?
Yeah, they weren't here when you answered it, so now they're back.
Okay, I'll answer it quickly again. That it's not the end of the world if that's what they have, but I would suggest that when you contract with your consultants, you tell them that you're expecting 3-part specs to be included in the specs ahead of time before you get a fee from them, and give them plenty of time to prepare one. If they are going to put them on the drawings and that's all that they will do, I would suggest you review them and make sure that they're not putting any conflicting language in or leaving out anything important in the administrative requirements for the project or warranty requirements or things like that. It's not the end of the world. It is not the preferred way to do things. All of your consultant specs should be in your specs, and spec language shouldn't be on drawings, but there are some that do that. And so just do your due diligence in making sure that they're not leaving stuff out and they're not garbage. But I would just ask my consultants ahead of time. But most people don't, when they're contracting with their consultants, they're not thinking about stuff like that yet. They're just looking for a consultant to do the job. They're not thinking about putting requirements in their contract with the consultant saying you have to provide 3-part specs. We want them in the CSI format. it's so unreasonable to go sign contracts with your consultants and get down to CDs and say, oh no, you have to follow perfect CSI format in your specs. And they've had these specs they've had for 30 years. Rewriting a master, depending on the size of the firm and how many specs you're taking, could take weeks, months, or even a year or two. I spent an entire year at one firm just getting the masters in shape, and that's the only thing I worked on for an entire year, is rewriting the masters. It's a lot of work. So if you're going to ask your consultants for something they don't have, ask for it at the time you're contracting with them so they have plenty of time. Number one, they can have a fee that covers their time to do that, and they have plenty of time to do it.
All right, Cherise, I have a two-part question here.
Great.
What are your thoughts on specifications built around a basis of design product versus specs built around performance metrics? Part two.
I mean, there's no good answer to that. It depends on the product or system you're talking about. I personally like basis of design specs because there are no exact equals. So trying to write out all the technical requirements and have them jive with 3 different manufacturers is damn near impossible. So I love to say the basis of design is this manufacturer for this product, and here are all the technical components of that product. And these other manufacturers, if they have an equivalent type of product, can also bid. And just write them around one product, because there are no 3 that match. And trying to write it and define those differences in a spec is a nightmare. I love writing specs that way. It makes everything so much more clear, I think, for everybody, because those other manufacturers can bid. And we typically put those other manufacturers in there because we know they have a product just like that one. But not every single line item technical component that we put in the specs is going to match. And otherwise, you got to write out all the technical components for each manufacturer, and that doesn't even make sense. But sometimes you're going to want to do a performance spec because how it performs is the most important thing over who provides it. So there is no real answer to that. Your specs, there are a couple other types of specs. You're going to write those based on what you're trying to accomplish with that particular product and system.
So what would you suggest to a contractor is the best way to navigate specs that have both approaches and they're conflicting?
Read your specs. Because, I mean, there are 5 or 6 methods of specifying that can be used in a spec, and you may get a spec with all 5 or 6 in them. And I mean, you're going to always see that. I don't know of anybody who writes a spec that uses only one method. You'll see a little bit closer to that in like public works specs because of their requirements, but you're always going to have differently written specs for different products. There's just there is no thing to make that easier except to read all your specs and make sure you understand them before you do the work. Because you're going to see things that the spec writer did wrong. I do things wrong all the time. I own it. I do things wrong all the time. Maybe it's because a piece of information didn't make it back to me or I misunderstood something. And the best way to avoid a real mess on the project is to read your specs ahead of time so you can ask questions, because nobody knows building a building better than a contractor. Architects don't go out and build buildings every day. They don't go through all of the things that happen on the job site 8 or 10 hours a day, every single day. They come out for a once a week job meeting. And so in all honesty, contractors do a better job of reading and understanding the documents than any other member of the project team. You know your stuff. You look at this section, something doesn't look right. You can ask before you've spent money or ordered something or installed something because you were missing a piece. And I guess that's my best piece of advice. I don't know, maybe Jake or Allie would want to add something in there.
With Jake's question.
Jake keeps laughing over there, so I'm going to call him after this session and tell him, you need to quit going into convulsions over there because you don't like what I'm saying.
So how do you respond to a contractor's VE for a product not listed as BOD or BOD?
I'm not sure I completely understand that question. But basically, I'm assuming that when you're asking that question that we've listed a basis of design in the spec and the contractor wants to install something else.
You said that value engineering and basis of design. So you want me to go back and read it again?
Yeah, well, no, I understand what value engineering and basis of design are. I guess the first thing I would say to that is the contractor doesn't just independently value engineer anything. Contractor is required by contract to build what is in the contract documents. Now, let's say we have a really volatile political environment, which we have had in the recent past, and tariffs and things like that, that at the time the contractor bid the job, they bid $1 million. I'm just picking a number. And now they're getting to this point in construction, tariffs and stuff happen. And now all of a sudden these things were one price when they bid the job, but because of the tariffs and everything, now they're twice as much. And so the project's not going to meet budget, and something has to be VE'd out in order to get the project under budget, because we have to have that steel for the framing or whatever. Contractor doesn't choose to VE anything. And I hear questions like that all the time where people think that the contractor's out there just willy-nilly deciding what they're going to use and what they're not. It doesn't work that way. If the contractor wants to use something different or there's a reason they need to, they have to come to the table with the architect and the owner, and we have to hash that out. We have to issue a change order. We, on the design side, might have to redesign something to meet that. And so there's a whole process involved in that if the contractor is going to choose something other than the basis of design to use. But this is not something that contractor can ever do under a typical construction contract on their own. They don't VE anything. It's a team thing when you have to VE out work to meet the budget. And to approve a different product than what's in the documents. Contractor doesn't get to just choose to do that. They have to ask for a substitution if it's not something we've already named.
Cherise, can I add to that a little bit?
I knew Jake would not make it.
I couldn't.
No, please do. Please do.
No, if I read that question narrowly, what I'm seeing is that the spec may not have been constructed well enough to have multiple options. They just had a basis of design. And at that point, the spec is not very flexible. So the contractor is either going to charge you an arm and a leg for the one thing that you put in the spec, or they're going to provide an alternative because there's nothing else listed in the spec. Now, if there were 3 other options, then everything you said comes into play. You have to have a conversation. You have to say, so are these 3 other options actually roughly equivalent or acceptable? I mean, you put them in the spec, but let's ask the question anyway. And but if the spec isn't constructed with any flexibility, say there is only one version of what you want in the project for that, as an architect, I think you have to manage the owner's expectation that that's going to be an expensive thing if it's the only thing you'll accept to go into the project.
Well, yeah, and that's not I'm going to qualify this in a minute, but that's not a good way to write specs, because you're basically giving your contractors or subs an open checkbook if you name only one thing. That said, there are very good reasons sometimes that we specify only one thing. And you'll see that more often on remodeling projects where we're having to match something else in the building. So it has to be that one thing and nothing else. So we did that very intentionally. And if we only list a basis of design and we're willing to listen to other options, then the contractor would put in, well, put in a substitution for approval. They still wouldn't just go choose something else. It would still have to be a conversation. Another product would have to be approved, and if that other product was approved, it would have to be incorporated into the contract documents via a change order or something to make it a contractual change. And understanding that sometimes contractors do come to us and say, okay, I only allow substitutions for like 4 reasons in my specs during construction. One of those reasons is that there are substantial cost savings to the owner for a comparable project. So if we just have one thing, or we have 4 things and that one isn't, that the contractor wants that's cheaper, isn't listed, we absolutely are going to entertain looking at a substitution request for that and looking at whether we feel it's a comparable project. Now, I've heard all the stuff from reps and that's garbage compared to my product. And we're going to look at all those things. And sometimes the owner is willing to take, sometimes it's a good, better, best situation when you're specifying, depending on budgets and how things are panning out. And if it's a really big chunk of change savings to use something that's better but not best, and we specified best, the owner may be willing, because at the end of the day, the final decision is with the owner. It's their money and their building. They may say, for $100,000 deduction, to use this, or maybe they specified something good, but this better thing is just a little bit more, but it's like going to last 10 years longer. The owner has the right to make those decisions and take something that is of less quality if it's going to save them money or make something else happen that they want to. So there's a lot of variables that happen in that situation.
Looks like all the questions, Cherise.
Wow. Okay, so now any people actually want to talk out loud, you're welcome to ask a question. I'll give you a second if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, and otherwise we'll go have dinner and a cocktail.
I do see another question here from Where D. How much standing does the specifier have to ensure the specifications are adhered to?
By the contractor?
No, just that's in general. Yeah, I would assume by the contractor.
How much pull a specifier has and what's happening during construction is not much. We're consulted a lot during CA. They'll come ask us questions, but at that point, whoever the PM for the firm is that's handling CA is the one dealing with the owner and the contractor. Will be more in an advisory role by that. If you're talking about during design and how much influence do we have on making the teams comply with standard processes and getting the right information in, depends on the firm. It depends on when we're getting our information. If a team is giving me a chunk of information the day before a deadline, I likely don't have a lot of time to have any arguments about anything. I'm lucky just to get the information in. If we're starting a process early in design, there's plenty of time for conversations and to tell people why they might not want to use something or why they might. There are so many variables. Sometimes specifiers have a lot of clout. Sometimes they don't have any. And that can change from one day to the next.
Cherise, this is Dave Ware.
Hi.
Those were my questions, and you answered them very well and very admirably. They were loaded questions. There will always be situations where the contractor feels he or she knows the project or the products best, and will, under the umbrella of value engineering, choose something else. There will always be a situation where the contractor will choose a product because of the relationship that he or she has with that product manufacturer, regardless of what the specifications say. And shame on them for allowing it, but in the end, it's about getting that facility constructed. So that is kind of a segue to the question that I posed related to the clout that the specifier has. And I think you answered it great, because it's really, again, about relationships. You can have a bang up great specification that meets all the 4 C's, but if you don't have a good relationship with the firm or the organization for which those specifications are being written around, you have to, it's going to take a while for those specifications to become useful to the project team for other projects. In other words, the team itself has to collaborate and have confidence that you understand as a spec writer, that you understand your stuff. And that filters down, or should say throughout the project, to the design team, to the engineering team, to the subcontractors, and ultimately to the contractor who chooses through the bidding process those products that are put forward. I've been on living building challenge products where I know that my material is the only product that can be installed, and it was not installed. Okay, I mean, and we will always run into those situations. So the specifier has to build that relationship with the project team from the get-go, and build that relationship constantly, because there's turnover, and not all projects from a given firm are going to use the same master spec. They will all be different throughout the process.
Yeah, well, I would like to just touch on a couple things with that, because I don't necessarily agree with everything that you said. Number one, I don't think anybody knows how to build the building better than a contractor. And so a lot of times when they're bringing stuff to the table, they've got input that we don't have on the design team, that it's a really damn good suggestion. But I don't know anything about your living building project, but regardless of what we specify, the owner has the right to choose something else, even if, and I worked at a firm once where the owner wanted something where we as a design team were mortally opposed to it. And so we made the owner sign a release of liability for us for that product, because we knew it wasn't in their best interest, and they were replacing it a year later. Of course we care that a good building goes up, and that we try to do the best products that we can within the budget that we're allowed, that owner has, to get them what they want. But just because we put a product in and this is the one we want, doesn't mean that that's never going to change. In contractor, I can't reiterate this enough. The contractor cannot value engineer anything out on their own. That there's a contractual process to use something other than what is specified. And in order to go through that contractual process and use a different product, that means the owner has bought off on it, and so has the architect. And that is a decision made between the 3 of them for any variety of number of reasons. I don't want anybody leaving this webinar thinking that anybody on the project team, as a project is being designed and built, can just go do whatever they want and change something out without all of the parties of the contract coming to the table. Because it's just not, it's contractually, if the contractor goes and puts in something else without telling anybody, we have in our contract that we can make them rip it out and put in what was specified at their cost. So that's a whole different ballgame. If they're violating the contract if they do that. That whatever that item is that got installed instead of the one that you had in there was approved by everybody involved contractually. And they made an educated choice about that, whether you agree with it or not, for whatever reason that they did. And obviously every project is different as far as why people make the choices they do or what's driving that, but the contracts are never different. Those requirements, while there'll be nuances to every contract, those basic requirements are the same on every project. And that can't happen without everybody knowing it. Any other questions? Flowers, jewelry. I'll take all of it.
She takes vacations to warm destinations.
Oh, that's my number one. Vacations to warm destinations. Anybody wants me to come speak to their company and they're in a warm place that has palm trees and coconut drinks, I am. Especially after what, 4 months of lockdown, I'm going insane. If there's no other questions, last chance, going once, going twice. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope you took something away with this. And, you know, if I got my Christmas present today, you'll all be in my CDT class starting August 12th. And then we can all be doing a better job in this world. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherise.
Thanks,
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Cherise.
Bye, Maddie.
Bye.
I'll wait for everybody to sign out.